My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with George M. Tabor about wine and the rocky evolution of wine bottle closures. He's written a new book on the subject called To Cork or Not to Cork, The Billion-Dollar Battle for the Bottle.
It's not just purely a research problem, but it's also an education problem. And I hope my book helped with that, is to make consumers more aware of the variety of problems that can be in the wine. Again, I keep coming back to things like Brettanomyces, which is it's a barrel problem, and a lot of people, when they taste those things, they just say, "Oh, it's the cork." Well, no, it may not be the cork. And I think the wine industry and wine makers have got to do a better job of explaining and educating the consumers.
See also the Marketplace of Ideas podcast on iTunes. For my money, the easiest, most convenient way to subscribe to all the podcasts you love. Get the Marketplace every week by popping open your iTunes, going to the iTunes store, and searching for the Marketplace of Ideas. Here at the Marketplace of Ideas, we want to know where our listeners are to arrange for possible live appearances, to arrange for certain guests in certain places, or really anything. Visit our Frapper map online on our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace, and click on the link that says, add yourself to our Frapper map here. It's very easy, just a couple clicks, and you can join the International Marketplace of Ideas listening community. My guest is George M. Tabor, wine journalist and a former business editor at Time magazine. He examined the momentous Paris wine tasting of 1976, from which he originally reported with Judgment of Paris. His new book, To Cork or Not to Cork, The Billion-Dollar Battle for the Bottle, documents the development of wine bottle closures and the ensuing struggles between competing technologies. George, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, when I say 1976, wine enthusiasts automatically know exactly what I'm talking about, but I fear that some listeners may not. Now, since you've been there, you were there, you reported, you're probably one of the most qualified people to talk about that event. Could you describe in brief what you witnessed on that fateful day?
Sure. On May 24th, 1976, there was a little unpublicized event. There was a blind tasting between a few unknown California wines and some of the most famous French wines around. The judges were all French, and the wines were the best that France could ever put up. And at the end of the day, to the shock of the French judges, California wine had won in both the white category and the red category. Both of the wines were from 1973, and they were Stag's Leap wine cellars, and also on the red side, and Chateau Montelena on the Chardonnay side. That event really changed the history of California wine, because up to that point, California wines were kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of world wine. They didn't get any respect. After that, they had a lot of respect.
It's been called history's most important wine tasting. At the time, how much of that importance did you realize?
Oh, I wish I could say that I saw immediately that it was an earth-shattering event. I've got to candidly say that I thought I had a story in time, but I had no idea that it would have the impact that it did.
You said you were sure the French wines would win.
Yes, in fact, not only I was sure, I think everybody in the Paris press corps was sure that the French wines would win. That was why I was the only journalist who was there that day. The other journalists were smart enough not to attend the event.
It was assumed to be a foregone conclusion, but it certainly wasn't. Now, you've been quoted as saying, when you wrote your previous book, Judgment of Paris, about this event, you were going to set the record straight on 76. What parts of the record needed straightening?
Well, there's a lot of myths that come up about the Paris tasting. On the French side, The myth was that they didn't know what was really happening. They didn't realize that there were going to be California wines being tasted as well as French wines. Actually, they knew exactly what they were testing that day. But it was very convenient to say, well, no, they really didn't. I interviewed 6 of the 9 judges immediately after it was over, and there was no question that they knew what it was. On the American side, also some myths that grow that it somehow, this had been a big thing. In fact, one account that I read of is that there was the tasting took place under a picture of Thomas Jefferson, and the red, white, and blue flags were up there.
Dear.
It was not. It was a very small. There were only about 20 people in the room, which is amazing for something that had such a worldwide impact.
One of the elements of the legend, or maybe it's true, that lives on is that some of the testers will not talk about it to this day. Did you find that to be the case?
Yes, there were 3 or 4 of the judges who still would not talk to me. As one of them said, it's still too painful.
Oh, dear. Moving on to the new book, To Cork and Not to Cork, it focuses on the question of what should seal a wine bottle. How important a debate, how active a debate is that in wine today?
Oh, it's a huge debate. It's probably the most controversial issue, and it's a bit like the wars of religion. People have very strongly held positions. They don't compromise easily, and they think they are right, and the whole whatever they think they're right, and the rest of the world that doesn't agree with them is wrong.
Now, when casual wine drinkers think of what's in the neck of their bottles, they envision just a plain natural cork, the most traditional closure. And you've included a number of anecdotes in the book, and I find them to be a little bit painful about the phenomenon of cork taint, ruining the perfect moment like a Harlan estate. You open it up, and it's wrecked by cork taint. But what is cork taint?
Cork taint is, there are actually 2 types of taint, and they're very similar. And I think one of the problems is that it's really impossible for anybody to distinguish between what is cork taint and what is cellar taint. And I'm one of the things I'm trying to emphasize with the book is to make cellar taint better known, because in some ways cellar taint is more important. But cork taint was the original version of it, and it's a chemical compound that comes with a complex chemical reaction on some cork, and nobody knows for sure how many, but somewhere probably between 1 and 10% of all bottles are corked, and they get an off flavor. They're just being compared to, they have kind of the smell of damp newspapers or moldy newspapers. It's a kind of a mold that grows on the wines. It grows in the cork and then gets into the wine, and it can ruin a bottle of wine. Cellar taint, on the other hand, very similar, just a slightly different chemical compound. But if that gets into a winery, and it's gotten into a lot of wineries around the world, that can ruin a whole batch of any wines that are made in that winery at that particular time. Well, a cork taint will only wreck just one bottle. A cellar taint can ruin a whole vintage.
Now, how widely recognized is cellar taint among wine drinkers?
I think it's very seldomly recognized, and when it is recognized, it's probably considered to be cork taint, because cork taint has become a catch-all, unfortunately, for cork, and I think it really is an unfair crack at them. Anytime a bottle of wine doesn't really taste right, whether it be Brettanomyces or cellar taint or just, bad winemaking, everybody always says, oh, that's cork taint. Well, it may or may not be.
So the natural corks take a lot of this blame. And your book begins practically at the dawn of wine history. How did we come to use these corks in the first place?
Well, because cork is such a magical instrument. It seals the containers so well. Nothing, although in our modern age we're coming up with different ways to seal containers, but cork in a lot of ways still stands out as the best way to do it. It compacts very tightly so you can get it into the bottle. At the same time, it's fairly easy to get out of the bottle, and you can reuse it. It's a natural product. So, it has a lot of advantages, which why it was used for 1,000 years to seal wine jars between 500 BC and 500 AD. Then it wasn't used for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Came back into use in about 1600 with the invention of what was then called the English bottle, the common inexpensive bottle we know today. And that was very successful. And for 400 years, it was the only way to seal a bottle of wine.
Now, between the years 500 and 1500, there was a dark age in which humanity existed without cork. How did that come to pass?
Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, international trade really slowed down. Most corks come from Spain and Portugal, and so they just weren't being shipped around the way they were previously. In the Dark Ages, of course, there wasn't a lot of money to be drinking especially good wine. Yeah. And also, wine was being aged in a product that was invented or got into wide use right near the end of the Roman Empire, and that was the wooden barrel that we have today. So wine was shipped in barrels and then was poured into pouring pitchers and then was usually served, rather quickly. In those days, old wine was considered bad wine. Yeah. The value of wine went down as soon as the new vintage of wine came on the market, because wine is without a seal like a cork or a screw cap is in the process of turning into vinegar. Air is the enemy of wine, and so old wines were considered to be on their way to becoming vinegar, and they were.
So in the old days, you drank wine quickly, you drank it young, or you didn't drink it at all.
Exactly.
So when in history did the trio of the glass bottle, the cork, and the corkscrew, as we know the trio, come together?
Well, it really was all started by that English bottle.
Yeah.
The glass bottles had existed before, but they were very expensive. They were rather light and fragile, and so they broke easily. With the English bottle, they had a product that could be shipped around, and then they rediscovered cork as a wonderful way to seal those bottles, and then finally they came up with a corkscrew, which was the way to get the cork out of the bottle.
What did some of the people try before corkscrews as a cork removal system?
There used to be something that was used in guns that was used to pull out the bullets of guns if the bullet got stuck in the barrel. And that was one of the devices that was used. But they used all sorts of crazy things. One of the big problems they had was they couldn't get the darn corks out. So sometimes they would knock the top of the bottle off. That was a very common way of doing it.
All those stories made me so happy to be born into the age of the corkscrew.
Right. And this was even before the rabbit.
Yeah, exactly. No rabbits then. No siree. Yeah. So back in those days, people were transitioning from drinking young wine to drinking aged wine. When did they begin to age wine? How did they begin to do it?
Well, by the late 1600s, they were already starting to age wine. One of the big and early users of cork, of course, was also champagne winemakers, because of all the pressure that you have in a bottle of champagne, because of the bubbles and the gases kind of trying to force whatever the closure is out of the bottle. Cork was again an ideal way to seal a bottle of champagne.
Now, tell us about the nature of the cork industry itself and how it spent the first very large chunk of its life as a natural monopoly. Yes.
Well, cork, because it was the only product that was there that was sealing wine bottles, it was a very backward industry. It was largely in Spain and Portugal, not two of the industries of the last few centuries. It was a backyard industry almost, especially the production of corks. There were thousands of producers. There was very little quality control because, as I said, it was a backyard industry, a mom and pop industry. Lots of producers sold to very few companies that actually exported the corks. The people who were exporting the corks didn't control their own methods of production, and so they were being handed off qualities of cork that were not the best. So in the late, I found a reference in the late 1600s where people are already starting to complain about bad corks, this cork problem. Well, first of all, they didn't know what was causing it, so it's rather difficult to control something if you don't know what causes it. And two, they really didn't have an alternative to do it. And thirdly, it was not a widespread problem in those days. It was really very, very rare. But starting in the 1980s, various things came together that suddenly a problem that was just kind of a minor nuisance became a serious problem. In 1981, a Swiss scientist discovered exactly what caused cork taint. And it's always easier to control a problem, or at least to address it, if you know what it is. So that made it easier to address the problem.
Now, he found the chemical compound TCA, correct?
That's exactly it.
And
Trichloroanisole.
how did he find it was getting in?
It was getting in through the corks. His name was Hans Tanner. He was a Swiss researcher. He turned out to be correct on this, was that in those days they were using chlorine to bleach the corks. The value of cork is based on how clean it looks, how white it is, and how few holes are in the cork. The problem was that they were using chlorine to improve the cosmetic look of corks. It was that chlorine that was causing the TCA problem because it was getting into the cork.
Now, you quote Hugh Johnson as saying that if every consumer recognized cork taint, the industry would go bust. How true is or was when he said that statement?
I think it's still true. I mean, he told me that statement when I was researching the book, so it was only about a year ago. And the fact is that a lot of people do not recognize cork taint. I think that's particularly true probably in the United States, where wine consumption is still relatively new for a lot of people, and they may have not yet developed their experiences. Hugh Johnson says he recognizes it a lot. In fact, he sees it a lot in champagne, which is not surprising because cork taint appears more in white wine than in red, and more in low-alcohol wines than high-alcohol wines.
Wines that maybe more experienced drinkers would be drinking?
Yes, yeah, but even your experienced drinkers would be drinking would probably be drinking a lot of red wine, so they may not see it as much as people in, say, New Zealand, where they drink an awful lot of Sauvignon Blanc and export even more. It's in wines like Sauvignon Blanc where you are most likely to get cork taint. Riesling is another wine where it's very common to get cork taint.
Now, in the 70s, Australian producers tried their hand at screw caps as a solution to this, but it didn't quite pan out. What happened?
Yeah, there was a market reaction. Then, as now, the consuming wine public makes a link between screw caps and poor quality wine. Because not only in the United States, but also in places like Australia, cheap wines were usually in screw cap. And therefore, the people had this link. And so sales of wines in the 1970s in Australia, they tried it for 4 years, and there was just a market reaction against it. I think the other fact that made it probably that was that that was before you had this explosion of cork taint in the 1980s.
Sure.
So by the 1990s, when the Australians and New Zealanders got back and tried it again, now there was a greater recognition of the problem. There was a greater awareness of the cork problem because people had run into it more often.
Now, you've mentioned before, and you just mentioned again, the large increase in cork taint in the 1980s, and you tie it to, among other things, Portuguese political upheaval from the mid-70s.
Exactly. There was a revolution in Portugal that basically swept away years of fascism and dictatorship that the country had always been living in. I mean, Portugal really, until the 1970s, was never a democracy. It's a very prosperous democracy now. But what happened, there was about 18 months of real major political upheaval in the country. The cork forests were taken over by worker cooperatives who tried to run the forests and tried to run the production, and usually did a pretty bad job of it because they were, it was people's capitalism, and people's capitalism is not usually very good at quality control.
Oh, you got that right.
That was the problem they were having was quality control. So there was that. There was another phenomenon in the 1980s, and that was the growth of wine consumption around the world. In places like Australia, New Zealand, those countries all wanted cork. There was a huge demand for cork, and they started putting some products on the market that they shouldn't have, and I think today would admit that they were inferior products. So there, again, another cause for the increase the incidence of cork taint. And the third factor, I think, is this fact that it was, as I said, in 1981 that they finally identified what was the cause.
Yeah.
And it's easier to attack a problem if you know what the cause is.
Exactly. You mentioned the increase in wine consumption in the 1980s. How did that come about? How did the demand rise so much?
Well, that was the globalization of wine that I got into a lot in my first book on the Judgment of Paris. And I really think it started with the Judgment of Paris, which recognized California wines as being of high quality internationally. And the big difference was that the California, before the Paris tasting, France was on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And the general opinion was that the French made great wines, but everybody else made plum. But after the Paris tasting, it was recognized that California was making very good wines, and then the winemakers around the world, in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they all started saying, look, if the Californians can make great wines with their land and their climate, maybe I can make it in my place. So it lifted everybody's game, and the quality of wine has dramatically increased. I like to say that I think we are living in the golden age of wine. There's never been so much good wine made by so many people in all parts of the world.
That is true. You mentioned another bit of turmoil, a Ukraine Chernobyl nuclear plant that put a dent in the regional wine industry there as well.
Yes. Yeah, because after the nuclear explosion, the Swiss and the Swedes in particular didn't want to. Those are two countries that drink a lot more wine than they produce themselves. The Swedes don't produce any. The Swiss don't produce much.
Yeah.
They import a lot of wine, and they were importing it from France, but they didn't want to, that particular year, to get wine from places that had been subject to the nuclear fallout.
Yeah.
And one place that hadn't been subject to that nuclear fallout was Australia. So there's a huge popularity of wines from Australia that particular year, and then after that, the Australians were into a lot of new markets, and they did very well.
Let's talk a little bit about Australia. You described them in the 1980s as jumping straight to the vanguard of scientific wine research. And what did they do to get there?
Well, there's a cooperative organization in Australia called the Australian Wine Research Institute, AWRI, and it's a cooperative in that they tax all winemakers and all grape growers, and then the money goes into research. It was established in the 1950s and has just been a gold mine for research because they have a separate source of funding. In fact, unlike a lot of the United States research institutes like University of California at Davis that are always underfunded and always scrambling around for money, the Australians have a lot of money. They spend about $25 million a year on wine research. The United States spends about $2 million a year. A huge difference. Yeah. And so Australia has done some of the leading research on usually problems that affect them. And for a variety of reasons that are not fully understood even today, Australia and New Zealand have more cork taint, or seem to have more cork taint, than any place else in the world. Oh. My speculation on that, and speculation that even the Australians agree with, is that it's because they are so far from Portugal.
Oh, really? They're just the distance.
The distance, it's a long way. They cross the equator, and in that long trip, a lot can go wrong with the cork. And so even they may start out as good corks, but they may arrive in Australia and New Zealand with troubles. The Australians, being paranoid, think that the Portuguese dump all their bad corks on Australia. I'm not sure that's correct anymore. But there does seem to have been a higher incidence of cork taint in Australia and New Zealand. Therefore, it was in their interest, or they were really interested in finding a solution to the problem of cork taint that nobody else could do. So that's why they turned so quickly to screw caps.
Oh, I see. They had more of an incentive to do so.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned in the book, in the 80s as well, a very busy decade for wine. that the problem, as we mentioned before, of cellar taint and its associated cover-up arose. How was that identified and treated?
Well, this occurred first in France
Yeah.
in the 1980s, and they spent years before they just couldn't get their hands around what exactly was happening. They also covered it up. Nobody knew that this had even happened until well into the 1990s, 20 years after it had happened. Yet it was widely known within the industry at the time. In fact, winemakers used to come home and they would walk in the door and their wives would say, "Get out of here, you smell of that terrible cork taint so much." One of the things about cork taint is that one of the side effects of it is that it dulls, if not kills temporarily, your sense of smell. So if you're working in an atmosphere where there's a lot of cork taint, you don't smell it. But when these winemakers got home, their wives sure smelled it and told them about it. And they, so everybody was concerned about it, and they were starting to do research. And then they, by the late 1980s, they had finally discovered what the problem was. And the problem was that the cause of this type of cellar taint was that they were putting in lots of new equipment. The 1980s were a very prosperous decade for French wines. That famous 1982 vintage that Robert Parker wrote to fame.
Oh, yes.
And so they had a lot of extra money. They're putting in new barrels, and they were painting the barrels and also painting their cellars with a flame retardant that had the same chemical reaction as chlorine had. The only trouble was that it wasn't just hitting a bottle here and there. It was wrecking a whole cellar. If they, for example, they put it in the rafters of this new winery, and they were very proud of. They were painting their bottles, their barrels to show how wonderful and prosperous they were, and they were actually causing this cellar taint. So, finally, a researcher by the name of Pascal Châtenay at the University of Bordeaux discovered what it was. And that resulted in a slightly different compound that's called TBA, as distinct from TCA, but the effect is the same. And it still continues in very recent times. Hansel, a California winery, had its wine spoiled in the late 1990s because of TCA. In that case, the TBA had come in through chlorine. So it can either be through chlorine or it can come in through this flame retardant, but the end result is the same thing, that a whole vintage of wines can be ruined, or at least badly affected.
In your chapter about the Hansel winery, you write that they were one of the first to break the silence about the cellar taint problem.
Exactly. Up to that point, the cellar taint that had occurred in France, the cellar taint that had occurred in several California wineries before, including Beaulieu Vineyard, Chalon, very leading wineries. Some of the other ones that haven't even become known had the same problem. And the CEO of Hansel, I think, took a very courageous step. And she said, and it helped, I think, probably, that this was occurring right when Enron was exploding.
Oh, yes.
And she saw that if she tried to cover it up and in effect pull an Enron and deny it and all this, she could ruin her whole winery. And so she decided to go public, and she did. And she on their website, and she went around the country trying to educate both consumers and the wine trade about this cellar taint problem. And as a result, today there's very little cellar taint actually taking place in California because they have been able to identify the causes of it, and it gets back to chlorine, by the way.
Oh, yes.
Because chlorine was a favorite way to clean wineries in California. And what they discovered at Hansel was it was one specific drain where the workers had poured pure chlorine, undiluted chlorine, down into this drain in an attempt to clean it. And they were scrubbing it. And at the time they were doing that, that's exactly what was causing the problem.
Chlorine as a cleaning agent was Hansel's issue then.
Yes, exactly.
No, the wine industry as a whole then owes a debt to Hansel's willingness to speak.
Absolutely. It's interesting. In 1981, when Hans Tanner, the Swiss scientist, discovered KCA, he published a paper, and the wine, his paper and a lot of his work was actually sponsored by a cork company. And that cork company, after he published his paper, were furious at him because he had gone public with their secret problem.
Yeah.
And but that was typical of what happened for 2 decades. In the 80s and in the 90s, you had, whether it was Cork Taint or Cellular Taint, the wine industry wouldn't talk about it, the cork industry wouldn't talk about it, and it was kept getting worse and worse. And it's only been in recent times that you have the challenge of screw caps, and therefore the cork companies are doing a much better job now in researching, but also you had a greater awareness of what could cause some of the cellar taint problems.
Let's talk about another challenger. How did the introduction in the 1990s of effective synthetic corks from the likes of Supreme Cork and Neo Cork change the cork market?
Well, this was the first companies, Supreme Cork in particular, to break the monopoly because they presented a product that at least in the short term provided a good enough seal that was taint-free, and so suddenly the winemakers that might have been just furious at their cork taint problems, they could turn to something and find a solution. So a company like St. Francis, which was one of the very first companies to adopt synthetic plastic corks, they went entirely to those synthetics because they had so much problem with cork taint. And so that really was the beginning of the breaking of the monopoly. Also, it was very important that in the British market, where they had a sufficient number of problems with imported products, especially from Australia with bad corks, they also just jumped on the synthetic synthetic product, and started using it widely.
What were the faults of these synthetic corks? What couldn't they match natural corks in doing?
Well, for starters, they are not really as good as a natural cork at sealing a bottle. As I said early on, cork is just a wonderful product, the way it can be compressed and it bounces back, and it just provides a very excellent seal. No man-made product that I've known, at least, and has been produced up to now, can match those qualities of sealing a bottle and bouncing back properly. As the critics of plastic corks say, that they're difficult to get out of the bottle and they're impossible to get back in. But the synthetic corks also have one great advantage, in that they are the low-floss producer. Synthetic cork is cheaper than any natural cork product, or a screw cap. It is so companies that are still doing, low-cost wines, if you're down in the $5 to $7 market, you can't put a 50 or 75 cent cork into your bottle, so you're likely to use a plastic.
For those just tuning in, my guest is George M. Tabor, wine journalist and former business editor at Time Magazine. His new book is To Cork or Not to Cork, The Billion-Dollar Battle for the Bottle. Now let's talk about these agglomerated corks, that's what they're called, like the Altec. They came along, and what were they?
Well, what they attempted to do was Altec, and it was really the first of the agglomerated products, which was to grind up the cork material and then remove what they thought was the TCA causing product in it. And at first, Altec, the Altec product was quite successful at first. In fact, it was a prisoner or a victim of its own success. It was so successful that the production just absolutely exploded, and they went from being about the 10th largest cork producer in the world to being number 2. And it was all on the basis of this wonderful Altec product. And again, they lost control of their production. The incidence of TCA in even Altec products started going up. And again, it was the problem was, since it was a man-made product, it was uniformly high. Again, unlike natural cork, which is randomly high, the Altecs were uniformly high, and the product basically was destroyed because of the bad publicity and all the problems they had. In fact, it really destroyed the company. Sabate was the company that was making it, and they went out. They did not go out of business. They were taken over by another company, and all the Sabate family members left the company. It was a great success at first, and a disaster later.
How much of the problems with the Altec were problems inherent in the actual TCA in the cork, and how much were the fact that people now had a brand name to blame for their problems?
The fact that there was a brand name was very important. So, because if you look at it, one of the things, even today, if you look at a cork, you have no idea where it comes from.
Yeah.
A cork is a cork is a cork. The largest cork producer, Amarin, is now starting to toy with the idea of branding its corks in one fashion or another, but it's just getting started, and they're having some problems doing that because winemakers want to have their own name on the cork. They don't want the name of the producer of the cork. But what Amarin would like to do, and they're toying with the idea, would be to have something like Intel inside, so Amarin inside. But they can't quite get their producers yet, their winemakers yet, to agree with that.
Do you think they will agree?
I think eventually they might, because it is, as natural cork has still got a lot of advantages. Don't count them out. They're spending a lot of money on research, trying to come up with a clean cork, trying to get rid of their cork problems. They have much better quality controls now than they ever had before. But it's taking time, and they had a bad reputation to overcome, but they are slowly getting better, I think.
Let's talk about Amarim a little more, how they fought back against the first wave of synthetic corks. They had their new invention called the twin top. What was the advantage of the twin top?
Well, the twin top seemed to, and does, combine the benefits of of agglomerate, but also the benefits of natural cork. So the way a twin top is set up, you have natural cork in a very fine layer at the top and the bottom of the cork. In the middle, you have the agglomerated corks. Because of the lower cost of production, you don't have any waste material in the agglomerated corks. They were able to bring the cost of their product way down, almost compete with plastic, although they still had slightly higher prices. But it was a good product. It had the quality, at least at the top and the bottom, that seemed to provide a very good seal and also protection against TCA. So the twin top, as it's called, was a great market success because of that. And I was just talking to a New Jersey winemaker a couple of days ago, and he just loves the twin top and thinks it's a great product.
If I'm not mistaken, an early adopter of the twin top was good old $2 Chuck.
Yes. Well, $2 Chuck, in an interesting kind of market approach, was, because it was an inexpensive wine, $1.99 in California, $2.99 in the rest of the country. It couldn't go, ironically, it couldn't have a screw cap because that would identify it as a cheap product.
Yeah.
Again, with that American mentality, if it's got a screw cap on it, it must be a cheap wine.
You think of the wino with the bag over the wines, unscrewing the top.
Exactly, drinking Thunderbird out of a brown paper bag.
Yeah.
Or their college student drinking
Exactly.
Thunderbird.
Oh, boy.
So $2 Chuck had to go to the classic higher end kind of product. So it went to the twin top, which was inexpensive, and yet it was a cork, and you got the pop, and it just seemed like it was a quality wine if it had a cork in it.
To sidetrack a little bit, what would you say is the importance of $2 Chuck in the wine world? What is its significance?
Oh, I think its significance and its role has just been huge because it is, especially after that event this summer when it won a wine contest.
Yeah.
I think it was university at the California State Fair, was it, or
something like that?
And but it shows that a lot of wine drinkers that some of the myths of the $100 bottles of Chardonnay and $150 bottles of Cabernets. There's a lot of hype in those wines, and there's still a lot of maybe not $2 Chuck, $2 wines, but under $10 you can still get a lot of good wines, and you got to be wondering about putting down $150. Are you really getting $150 worth of wine?
Yeah. Now, the Australians, ever the innovators, they delved deeper into research and development to fight cork taint, and one group, the Clare Valley Riesling Initiative, pushed especially hard on behalf of screw caps. What did they do?
Well, they banded together, and this was the importance of banding together can't be overemphasized, because there were 7 winemakers at the beginning, which was more than half of all the Eden Valley Riesling makers. Again, it was a Riesling wine that they were making. Riesling wines are often victims of cork taint, and so they had to find a way to get the product to their consumer in good fashion. So there was kind of a second interest in screw caps among the Eden producers. So they banded together and said, we're all going to do this, or all the members of the coalition at least would be doing it, so that would take away the marketing advantage that one or the other one might have if they'd stuck with cork.
Yeah.
And it was very successful as a result. They also took a unified approach to the marketing of it. They got a special bottle made for it in France that looked particularly good. And then they started selling their wine not on the grounds that this was a cheaper wine, but we think our wine is so good, we want to protect it. That was the idea. We were going to give you a protected wine. And their program was successful. In the following year, New Zealand did almost the same thing with actually more wineries in their coalition for the Sauvignon Blanc.
What went right this time that went wrong in the 1970s?
I think it was the greater awareness of the problem.
Oh.
I think that was one factor. I think the other factor was that a new generation of wine consumers was growing up that didn't necessarily have that image problem that the older generation, people of my generation, I hate to say, may have had towards screw caps. The convenience of screw caps, the fact that you don't need a special tool to open it, was also very important for that younger generation. So I think that it was just one of these questions that the timing was right. The timing was wrong in the 70s. The timing was right in the 90s.
And screw caps found even more success, flying colors success, in New Zealand, especially with Lawson's Dry Hills, due in part to what was called the New Zealand Screw Cap Wine Seal Initiative. What was that?
Well, that was the coalition of all. It started with, I think, 22 producers, and by the end, it's virtually all the wine producers in the country now are using screw caps, to the point that this year, 95% of all New Zealand wines will be in screw cap.
Wow.
It's almost impossible to find an Australian wine these days that is not in a screw cap. And if it's not in a screw cap, it is probably in one of the agglomerated, cleaned-up cork products called Diam, which is a French product. And Diam, in a lot of ways, is the son of Altec, the other product that we mentioned earlier, the agglomerated product that failed. Now they have an agglomerated product that looks like it's doing very well.
Now, I must come to the downside of screw caps' reductive problems, and what are those exactly?
Well, screw caps, ironically, create a perfect seal. Not ironically. They do create a perfect seal. And it's not certain whether a perfect seal is the best thing for a wine, because a perfect seal does not allow air to get in. And wine is a living product. That wine in a bottle is not a dead product. Their chemical reactions are still going on. And what they have started to discover of late, and I mean really late, like the last year or two, is that a little bit of air, like the little bit of air that comes in through a cork, appears to be very advantageous for the wine. It matures better, and it also doesn't come up with a different type of off flavor, but something that it's called reduction, that the best description of it that the experts usually use is that a wine that has been reduced or has reduction can smell a bit like rotten eggs. Not something you really want.
Yeah, no kidding.
Wine. Yeah, you can get rid of it if you do copper fining, which means that you put a little bit of copper sulfates or a tiny proportion of copper into your wine. But a lot of winemakers don't like to do that.
Is copper fining the most effective solution today?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
I see.
And most of those New Zealand wines that 95% under screw cap, the vast majority of those, I would bet, would have been subject to copper fining. So, consumers should be aware of that. With the screw caps, are probably using copper fining.
Is there any side effect of the copper fining? Any negative element?
No, but a lot of winemakers just don't like to use it. They like to have natural products, natural wines. Paul Draper at Ridge, he told me, I could use screw caps and use copper fining, but I'm not going to do it. I don't want anything to get between, nature and my wine.
Prefers more the state of nature for the wine. I see. Now, there's still another option on the table for wine closure, and that is the glass stopper. It's gone under names like Vino Lock, Vino Seal. Whitehall Lane released their 03 cabs with it. Am I right on that?
Yes, right.
And what is that?
Well, this is an interesting kind of back to the future solution, because in the 1840s, for several years, the English were sealing bottles with glass stoppers. They were. But again, they had the trouble of how do you get the glass stopper out of the bottle, and they were having to break it in order to get it out. So then so it was the glass stopper was developed in Germany by a kind of a tinkerer who was happened to be a doctor as well, and he lived in the wine growing area of Germany near Worms, the town of Worms, and he just developed it. He took the idea to Alcoa, the aluminum company, and Alcoa actually then developed it. And the glass stopper is not 100% glass. It has an O-ring that holds it in the bottle that is made out of a food-grade plastic. Yeah. And when you take the glass stopper out by pushing it with your thumb, and it comes off, rather easily. Some very big wineries in Germany and Austria now are using the glass stopper. The Schloss Vorrads, which goes back to the 11th century, so it's got a little history on its wines. It has turned 95% of its production over to glass, and the only other production it has are big bottles, which it has in screw caps. It has no corks anymore. Oh, wow. They've made the complete conversion. Yes. Now, what about the stainless crown cap, like on a beer? What are the challenges that the crown caps face? Again, mainly image. Again, it was started, it's been used in a variety of places. One of the places that I found that made a very serious approach at it was in Germany. And again, the image problem was that it was like a beer. It was like a beer sealer. Yeah. And people, you buy wines because you think it's better than beer. They don't want a beer cap on top of their wines. Where crown caps are starting to have some success, though, is with the sparkling wines or champagnes. You have to call them sparkling wines if they don't come from the area of Champagne. For most of its life, champagne or sparkling wines actually have a crown cap on them. For all of their period of secondary fermentation, as the bubbles are developing in the bottle, they use a crown cap because it is such a tight seal. Yeah. That's the great advantage of it. It is so tight. And it's only at the very last minute before the wine is shipped that they take the crown cap off and put in a cork. And so some producers now are saying, look, if it's good enough for most of the life of that bottle, why not just leave the crown cap on and send it out to the consumer that way? Yeah, it's already there. And Prosecco, which is an Italian-style sparkling wine, there are several brands that are using it in Italy for that. And just last year, Domaine Chandon, the Muerte Chandon outpost in California, just put its top of the line. It's $40 or $50 sparkling wine. Étoile is the name of it, under a screw cap. Wow. Not under screw cap, but under crown cap.
Yeah, crown cap. I love how you mentioned in the book Francis Coppola's Sophia sparkling wine that's in the aluminum cans.
Yes, that's again like a soft drink. I don't know about things like that. There's no question that it's convenient. It's a one service, but I think we're all going to be losing something if wine loses its magic and becomes, just another thing that you pop the top and chug it. There's something about the ritual.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Now, France, especially Bordeaux, they've been more suspicious of change when it comes to wine closures. What do you chalk that up to?
I think it's just traditionalism of France. I mean, I lived in France for several years, and France is a very conservative country.
Yeah.
They don't take on new things quickly, and they don't throw off old things quickly. And there are several wine producers who are really very big there, and are trying to push it. But what a lot of them are doing is they're shipping their wines under screw cap abroad, while at home they're still selling them with crown cap. Paul Blanc in Alsace is a producer like that, and I talked to him just a month ago when I was in Alsace, and he said he would love to go to 100% screw cap. His wines that come to the United States are in screw caps, but he said the French market just isn't ready for it. Domaine La Roche is a big producer in Chablis, and they're doing the same thing. And they're trying to educate the French. They're trying to show the advantages of it, but the French move slowly.
You think they'll just catch on given time?
I'm not sure, because I think that question will be easier to answer in maybe 5 to 10 years when, as I say in the book, it's very important for wine producers to come up with a better system, and to have more research, because right now there is no perfect closure. Corks have their downside, and screw caps have their downside as well. Cork's problem is, despite their research to date, they haven't yet proven. They've got some good statistics, but they haven't proved with a benefit of a doubt that they can produce a perfect cork, a taint-free cork. The screw cap people, on the other hand, I think have oversold the benefits of screw cap, saying it's perfect for everything, and this whole issue of reduction is still demands a lot more research. They're talking about coming up with a screw cap that maybe would allow in just a little bit of air, like corks do, but they seem to be having technical problems doing that. They haven't been able to develop it to date.
You advocate for more wine science in the book. How much better do you think that scientific wine research could be doing? What problems could they be solving?
Well, I think they could be solving those particular problems. And I think the other thing that is not just purely a research problem, but it's also an education problem. And I hope my book helped with that, is to make consumers more aware of the variety of problems that can be in the wine. Again, I keep coming back to things like Brettanomyces, which is it's a barrel problem, and a lot of people, when they taste those things, they just say, "Oh, it's the cork." Well, no, it may not be the cork. And I think the wine industry and the winemakers have got to do a better job of explaining and educating the consumer. But there is a lot more research that's going to have to be done on the side effects of screw caps, this issue of, is there any problem with wholesale copper fining of wines? It makes you a little nervous. Also, the improved quality of corks.
So you think when it comes to the wine world, we all have a lot more to learn?
Absolutely. There's no question about it.
Well, I think your book's going to help with that, certainly.
Well, thank you very much. I hope it does.
Visit George M. Tabor on the web at his Judgment of Paris site, www.judgmentofparisbook.com. George M. Tabor will come here to Santa Barbara on October 29th. First, East Beach Wine will be hosting a tasting starting between 4 o'clock and 4:30 p.m. Then, Borders Books Downtown will be hosting a signing at 7 o'clock p.m. Then, following the event, the Wine Cask will host a tasting. Visit their website at www.winecask.com. And during that tasting, he will bring multiple wines from around the world, bottled under different varieties of closures, so you can see for yourself whether you prefer the cork, screw cap, or what have you. All of the Place of Ideas music is produced by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, benalthouse.com. That's BENALTHOUSE. He's also been known to go under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his grooves on benalthouse.com. Feel free to leave your comments, questions, and reading suggestions for the audience on the Marketplace of Ideas listener hotline. The phone number is 805-585-3947. That's 805-585-3947. Be sure to check out our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. All feedback, please direct to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. And we hope to see you soon on the next episode of the Marketplace of Ideas.